Here we go again with another Elantra video. If you watched the last one where he put a used racing clutch in it, then you've seen the starting problems and how bad the wiring was. I had to do something about that. This is all the stuff I'm going to use to try to fix it, and I don't want to go all out and spend a bunch of money on new parts for this car. So I went stereo grade. Alright, fine, I'll do a shot for the OCD crew. The only spare cable I had was double-aught gauge, and I didn't have all the hardware for it, so I just spent just under $100 on all of this, including solder lugs, all the spare fuses, the circuit breaker, shrink tubing, waterproof fuse holders, a battery terminal, a distribution block, and 20 feet of 4-gauge cable. I figured 4 gauge is enough because for a 15 to 18 foot run, it's only 3% voltage drop on a 100 amp load. So it's less than half of a volt. It's safely rated for 150 amps at that length. Check the description for more info about wire selection and resistance. What we found up front was a melted main fuse box, the thing the alternator normally runs through. It says 60 amp. The fuse is still good. I found the starter, the alternator trunk wire with the blown fuse on it, and the main fuse box all terminated on the same bolt. This is all wrong, and the alternator charge wire here, even with a good fuse on it, wouldn't do anything. It's wired parallel to the main. That made that little fuse box, Grand Central Station. I'm lucky that I didn't have a bigger fire up here than I did. Just diggered. Look at it. It's digged. I mean, melted together. Yeah, charging problems. So my mission today is to run a dedicated charge cable from the alternator to the battery. The wires in the factory harness are all different diameters, and they're all cooked. It appears they're spliced and butt connected from the factory, and that would increase their resistance, so I'll be replacing that whole circuit all the way to the charge terminal on the alternator.
What are you doing in there, man? How did you figure that out?
Big hole in the floor?
Yeah. Oh, you came in through the bottom, huh?
Yeah, then I decided I wanted to get out.
You got it. Hi, Cole. Yay.
Now I got a seat.
That's hilarious. Well, Robert's here. I'm going to keep tearing this car apart.
The wires are routed into the main harness across the top of the front radiator support, and I intend to keep things where they belong for safety reasons. That means all the old electrical tape, wire looms, zip clips, and hardware that's in the way of me getting to those wires has to come off. Robert started looking a little bit bored, so I gave him something to do. As much of a pain as it is to get these wires out of the harness, the existing wires actually make my job a little bit easier because I can tape the old wires to the new cable and pull them through. Even if you use a knife to cut off all the old dry rotted electrical tape, by the time you've pulled all the clips, replaced the wires, peeled everything, and wrestled around with the radiator, you'll find that you're filthy and missing some skin. Your fingers will be worn out, and you'll be sick and tired of leaning over the car. In our travels, we discovered that the main power wire was jumped off the starter positive pole to Grand Central Station to power everything else. The starter offers less resistance than the rest of the electrical system when it's activated, so it would drain most of the current that everything else needed the moment the starter solenoid activated. This is why I bought the distribution block.
Does this really? Really?
Many people think you can just run a long positive wire to the trunk when you relocate your battery and just ground the negative to the body or the frame rail wherever they bolt it down. When you do this, you actually make the battery run in parallel to your car's electrical system. Not only that, the cable you use adds resistance to that part of the circuit. Just like water running downhill, electricity takes the path of least resistance. The result is that your voltage regulator doesn't see the battery's load on the electrical circuit once you start the car, so it only delivers enough power to keep the car running. It doesn't charge the battery. The battery's only completing the ground circuit. The way your car's wired from the factory, the alternator connects directly to the battery positive terminal in the engine bay. It's wired in series. The alternator is fused in the engine bay to protect it from a short to ground condition. So the alternator has a straight shot through a 60 amp fuse to the battery where the main engine harness is also terminated. Your battery's negative terminal is connected to ground on the chassis, and that's all it's supposed to do. All of your engine and interior's electrical parts are grounded to the chassis to complete that circuit. So if you move the battery to another location in the car, you need to maintain that configuration for the alternator if you want your voltage regulator to see the battery's load. It should be wired in series. On a DSM, the voltage regulator is integrated with the alternator. Running the alternator's charge wire directly to battery positive means charging the battery is no longer an option. All the drain on the electrical system is now pulled from one source, battery positive. This parallel battery situation has plagued this car since I got it. I never spent the time to fix it because I had bigger fish to fry, but now it's getting some love. I just need something to mount these. Oh hey, a piece of a busted fluorescent light. Perfect! I've done this before in another video. On my GSX I did it a little bit differently than I'm going to do it here today. I didn't install a fuse on the main power cable in front of the firewall. I relied only on a 150 amp breaker in the trunk of the car. You're supposed to have fail-safes positioned within less than a foot of cable length from the battery terminals for overload protection. And in many threads I've read, heated discussion has developed about how you need fuses on the other side of the firewall from it to prevent fires from a short to ground. This should be done for the alternator, sure, but the debate was about the main and the starter wires. I didn't do this on my GSX because I figured that a main power line goes to a fuse box. Why fuse a fuse box? I also figured that the breaker would be adequate protection if the starter ever got shorted to ground. Their logic is that a breaker doesn't blow fast enough to protect the components. So this time I'm using a fuse up front just to humor that discussion. I've got some fabrication work ahead of me to terminate my cable ends and mount all of these breakers, fuse holders, and distribution blocks securely. But now that I've babbled on long enough for you to know why I'm making these changes, most everything else I do here should be self-explanatory. To keep on topic with this car's minimal budget build, I'm also recycling an audio track from a different video. It only seems appropriate. Used music. The default wiring is configured so that the starter solenoid that triggers the starter's main power supply is on a fused relay, but the starter positive is a direct unfused connection to the battery. This is what happens when you install a fuse here. The starter draws 80 amp of current when it's not under load. Load the starter up with the physical weight of my rotating assembly plus the resistance of the 10.2 to 1 compression this engine makes, then also factor in the electrical load required by the fuel pump, ECU, knobs, buttons, lights, and switches, etc., and it puts a strain on even the biggest fuses I bought. After blowing several of the smaller fuses, I learned that the 100 amp fuses were only enough to start a cold engine. Even a 120 amp fuse takes a beating. If you wanted a fuse up here, get one that's the same amperage rating as the wire you're using. A quick probe across the battery terminals shows a 2 volt increase in battery voltage once the engine is started. That means it's charging. My wiring works. The alternator was rated for a 60 amp fuse on Grand Central Station, and the 60 amp fuse on the charge wire is holding up. But after I took it out for a spin and got it hot, it would blow any fuse on the main that you put in it the moment you hit the starter. Since my main fuse keeps blowing and leaving me stranded until the engine cools off, it's time to do a fix that the hippies used to do back in the 70s when these kinds of bus fuses were popular. You should never bypass a fuse if you need to have one in the circuit, because you can start a fire and destroy the components that it's supposed to protect. In my case, all this fuse is a point of failure. It's completely unnecessary. If you put a 150 amp main breaker on a wire rated for 150 amps, then unlike the way it's wired from the factory, there is overload protection for the starter. In addition, all of the car's electrical circuits are fused at the main fuse box for overload protection. It's pointless to fuse a fuse box, and if you shorted out your starter, the main breaker will trip without starting a fire. I have the foundation to at least get this car back on the track. Literally, I'm dying to see what this old GSX clutch will do for the Hyundai. I can only apologize for the lack of audio here and nothing more. It didn't stick. That's me in the far lane against a black diamond 2012 Cadillac CTS V 4-door. He red lighted. I sailed past him at the 330 foot, and since he had nothing to gain, he let out of it. It's a shame. It would have been a good race. People are reporting 14.5s to 14.2s from those without making any changes, and it's the underpinnings of a Corvette. You hear that? Even on my PCM camera, the volume control hit my sun visor and muted the video. At least you get a close look at that CTSV badge. We all learned something. I had to go through an awful lot just to see how this clutch feels. The GSX clutch feels great, and I'm shifting faster with better traction. However, I'm missing several miles per hour due to a boost leak. It's stuck between 8 and 10 psi no matter where I set the 10-year-old eBay boost controller. Might be the boost controller. Either way, I'll sort it out. Its worst two problems, aside from its looks, are now behind me. I've got a few other tricks up my sleeve aside from making it hold its boost in to help it make a little bit more power. I hope any of you who have considered relocating your battery have benefited somehow from this little experiment. Keep in mind that most racing regulations will require you at least install an external cutoff switch if you relocate the battery. This setup will not pass tech, but it will still give you the opportunity to manually disconnect it, and it would offer all the protection necessary for a street car. Be sure to follow the instructions for your battery box regarding ventilation and mounting, and if you need help selecting wiring for your components, check the description for more info and resources. I'll be back again soon with another Hyundai episode, as well as progress on other projects. Subscribe if you want notifications. Thank you for spending your time here with me on Jafromobile.